So the learning approach is behaviourism. Now, learning approach is an umbrella term and it refers to the behavioural approach and social learning theory. So if you get a question that's asking you about learning approaches, you can talk about both behavioural and social learning theory. But this one is going to focus on behavioural. So you need to be aware of the basic assumptions of the behavioural approach, including the ideas of classical and operant conditioning, and Pavlov's research for linking to classical conditioning, and then Skinner's research linking to operant conditioning. You also need to be aware of the two types of reinforcement within operant conditioning. So the assumptions of the behavioural approach. So they rejected the vagueness of introspection and they said it was really difficult to measure. So they are not concerned with the mental processes of the mind. Instead, behaviourists will focus on observable and measurable behaviour. They advocate the use of lab experiments because they want to maintain control and objectivity within their experiments. Now, behavioural approach and behaviourists will believe that learning is the same for all species and advocated the use of non-human animals in their research, so dogs, rats and pigeons. Now, they believe that we are born as a blank slate and our behaviour is a result of our interaction with the environment, and all of our behaviour has been learnt through our experiences. One way in which we can learn a behaviour is through classical conditioning. Now, classical conditioning is learning through association. Now, association begins with the word as. Classical has the word as in it, so classical is association. And an association is made between a neutral stimulus and a reflex response. And this was first demonstrated by Pavlov. Now, Pavlov's research is a key piece of research. So he conditioned dogs to salivate when a bell was rung. So remember, with classical conditioning, we talk about the idea before conditioning, during conditioning, and after conditioning. So before conditioning, food was an unconditioned stimulus, the UCS. Now that produced salivation. So food caused dogs to salivate. So food caused the unconditioned response of saliva. Bell was a neutral stimulus that produced no response from the dog. During conditioning, the food and the bell are paired together. So when Pavlov presented the dogs with food, he would ring a bell. Now, food is still the unconditioned stimulus, and bell is still the neutral stimulus, and the food is still causing the unconditioned response of the dog to salivate. Now, with enough pairings of those two stimulus, eventually the bell by itself becomes the conditioned stimulus that causes the dogs to salivate, which has become the conditioned response. Operant conditioning is learning through reinforcement, which means that a behaviour is more likely to be repeated, or punishment, which means a behaviour is less likely to be repeated. Now, there are two types of reinforcement. Now, it's really important that you do not get confused between negative reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement means that a behaviour is more likely to happen. So positive reinforcement is when a behaviour produces a pleasant consequence. You are rewarded for something. So for example, you've done a test, you've done well, and you get rewarded for it. Negative reinforcement is when you remove an unpleasant stimulus. Therefore, you are more likely to repeat that behaviour. So for example, your alarm goes off, the noise of the alarm is an unpleasant stimulus, unpleasant situation. You hit snooze, therefore you remove the unpleasant stimulus, therefore you are more likely to hit snooze in the future because you have gained escape from the unpleasant ringing. So when we looked at attachment, we talked about the idea of the caregiver being negatively reinforced. So when a baby cries, that's an unpleasant situation. They pick that baby up, stops crying, so it's removed that negative stimulus. Therefore, they are more likely to repeat that behaviour. Punishment means they are less likely to repeat that behaviour. So punishment is when someone receives a negative or an unpleasant consequence as a result of doing something, so they are less likely to repeat it. So for example, you're in class, you do something wrong and you get a detention. That would be a punishment. So you have to be aware about Skinner that researched this. So Skinner developed a special cage that was referred to as a Skinner's box, and he investigated operant conditioning in rats and pigeons. So in one variation of this, he had a cage and the rat would move around, it would accidentally press a lever and a food pellet would fall into the cage. So that was a reinforcer. So soon the rat learned to press the lever in order to gain food. So that was positive reinforcement. They do the behaviour of pressing the lever and they get rewarded. They get the food. Positive reinforcement. In his second variation, the rat was put into a cage in Skinner's box and there was an unpleasant electric shock running underneath. So the rat would move around, accidentally press the lever and the electric shock would stop. They learned that when the electric shock or the current was running through, if they pressed the lever, it would stop the electric current, and therefore they were more likely to repeat that behaviour. That is negative reinforcement because it's the removal of the unpleasant situation, the removal of the electric shock. So if we look at some questions on the AA1, a young woman says, when I was 5 years old, I was at a party and a balloon burst in my face with a loud bang. Even after all these years, I cannot bear to go to a room where there are balloons. They terrify me. Use your knowledge of classical conditioning to explain why the woman is terrified of balloons. So, for example, we'd say before the party, the balloon was a neutral stimulus that didn't produce any response. The loud bang is a unconditioned stimulus that causes the unconditioned response of being frightened or upset. At the party, the balloon, the neutral stimulus, is paired with the loud bang, the unconditioned stimulus that caused the unconditioned response of being frightened, and therefore she has now associated the balloon with the bang. So the balloon has now become the conditioned stimulus that causes the conditioned response of having a phobia, being frightened of balloons. Outline Skinner's research into reinforcement for 3 marks. So obviously there was quite a lot of bit of detail there. You have to be quite concise in your information, so either do the positive reinforcement. So Skinner developed a Skinner's box, a rat was put inside the box, it would walk around, accidentally touch the lever and it would get a food pellet. That resulted in the behaviour being repeated because the rat learned that if it pressed the lever it would get a food pellet. Positive reinforcement. In the second one, he had an electric current underneath, the rat would move around, accidentally press the lever and it would remove the electric shock. Negative reinforcement. You've got this one, explain how reinforcement might be used to encourage primary school children to pick up litter in a playground, 3 marks. So you could talk about direct primary reinforcement. So if children pick up litter, they are given a reward in particular, so they might get sweets or stickers for picking up litter, or you could talk about, you could link into token economy a bit more. So if they get for picking up a certain amount of litter, they get a certain amount of time to go on their toys or a computer or have golden time. So in terms of evaluation, we have some supporting evidence from the study that Watson and Rayner did with little Albert that demonstrated that a phobia could be learned through classical conditioning. So that was the study with the rat and the banging of the metal rod behind him. And he learnt a phobia of rats and it generalised to other white fluffy things. So he'd been conditioned to have that phobia. We have other explanations, so it's quite a mechanistic view of behaviour. So animals are seen as passive and machine-like. So we respond to stimulus and we have a response, whereas the cognitive approach emphasises the importance of mental events during learning. So we could compare it to the cognitive approach. It is useful in that it has led to some real-world applications. So the development of token economy, which can be used in prisons to help more pro-social behaviour and reduce antisocial behaviour, and particularly in the management of schizophrenia. So when we looked at schizophrenia, we looked at the idea that in an institution, a schizophrenic might be rewarded with tokens that they can exchange for certain privileges if they display behaviour that is considered normal. So if they don't display any behaviour that indicates any psychosis. In terms of testability, it has scientific credibility, so it makes use of the scientific method through rigorous experimental approaches. It's lab-based, therefore it has high internal validity. However, we could take that further if we wanted to. We could have a counter argument that actually, because it is so rigorous in its controlled settings, that it might be artificial, it might lack external validity in the idea of it lacks ecological validity due to artificial tasks. We could even talk about the idea of the use of non-human animals. So they advocated the use of dogs, pigeons, rats. Now humans have developed higher order thinking, and our behaviour might be much more complex than that of non-human animals. So therefore we should be cautious when generalising findings to humans, and we should be cautious through the use of extrapolation, so applying animal research to humans. So does it actually explain human behaviour? So in terms of evaluation type questions, you might get explained 2 strengths of the behavioural approach in psychology. So this is important to make sure that you do have at least 2 strengths and 2 weaknesses of the different approaches. Now in a 60 marker you wouldn't necessarily need to mention all 4 evaluation points, but you do need to be aware that you could be asked either 2 strengths or 2 limitations. So it's important to make sure that you have that when you come to do your evaluation and your revision. Discuss the contributions of behavioural psychologists such as Pavlov and Skinner in our understanding of human behaviour. So remember, discuss is outline and evaluate. So you're going to talk about outline, what Pavlov and Skinner have done. So Pavlov developed the idea of classical conditioning, talk about his research, try to use the keywords such as neutral stimulus, stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned response and conditioned stimulus. Skinner's box, Skinner's rats, the positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, and then how the evaluation, how have they helped our understanding of human behaviour? Well, classical conditioning has supported the idea that we can learn a phobia. That has also developed the idea that we could unlearn a phobia. So the use of systematic desensitization, the use of token economies, and then you could talk about actually has it helped understand our human behaviour, compare it to the cognitive approach as your weakness.